today let's talk about, it's chapter 11, and it's called The Flowering Christianity. Last time we were talking about the ascendancy of the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and it certainly did become very powerful. It had powerful tools, as we saw, roughly between the years 1000 and 1300. So today I want to talk about the culture of Christianity, the philosophy and theology that was going on, that was being practiced and taught in the same period. And in particular, for example, Thomas Aquinas. If you went to Catholic school, no doubt you've already met Thomas Aquinas, who lived between 1225 and 1274, and who gave to the church its dominant ideas, really, the dominating ideas of in theology and philosophy. And by the way, in this period of time, there wasn't necessarily a clear distinction between theology and philosophy. For many, they were one and the same, and so Thomas Aquinas you can think of as somebody who was a theologian, but also was a practitioner of Catholic philosophy. So in what sense does this Christianity flower? In what sense does it really become to dominate intellectually? And how does it do that? Well, a number of things are happening. When you go back to the period of the 11th, 12th, 13th century, education such as it existed, there was no mass education. Education was essentially Christian education. Education was essentially limited to very few people who would no doubt have come from prominent families in many cases. The only schools at that time were schools run by bishops, cathedral schools, for example. There were monastic schools as well. So what you're talking about primarily is Christian education. There were also, of course, universities. These are the beginning of the universities. The University of Paris, for example, which you'll find already by the 12th century, 13th century. You can still go there today, and you can see sort of the remnants of what things sort of looked like back then. But at whatever level, even at the university level, Catholic theology, Christian theology is going to dominate. And of course, Christian at this point is Catholic. There's no Protestants. It's going to dominate. And wherever it's challenged, the church will act very, very quickly in order to stamp out what are called heresies, such as it occurs, for example, in southern France in the 11th and 12th century with the emergence of what people called the Waldensians, and there were others as well, Albigensians, and I won't get into that right now, but those were people who believed other things than the church dominant belief or Orthodox belief, and they were literally stamped out in some of the Crusades, and that was the end of them, or at least the end of many of them. So the church dominated education quite clearly, and as I said, at all levels. Church also, because almost everybody who was literate was a churchman, somewhere in the hierarchy from the priesthood on up. And that meant that the church was often used by secular leaders also, because they were the only ones who were numerate, who knew math, and who also were literate in the language of the day. And of course, the language of the day is another reason for church domination. The language of the day was Latin, and that becomes the universal language. It's even thought of that way by the church itself. And it does become universal in the sense that there really are no competing languages at this point. Latin, the remnant, of course, left over from the Roman Empire. The secular languages, I call them secular, but in any case, the vernacular languages, as they're called, are really not quite coming into their own. They'll be doing that, of course. They evolve out of Latin, and I'm talking about Italian, French, Spanish, and a few others, Romanian. And those are languages that come along later, and they sort of challenge the monopoly, you might say, that the church has over the sort of linguistic monopoly, right? So all of that's in the church's favor. But the way the church also has an understanding of let's just call it the medieval ordo, the way that things are, the way that they're put together, sometimes referred to as the medieval cosmos. And that is roughly corresponds to the idea of the hierarchy. That is to say, God at the top, and then beneath him the Pope, beneath him, of course, the hierarchy of the church. But beneath the Pope, of course, comes the king, and then I suppose everybody else. So that's the notion of the hierarchy. That's how the Catholic Church understands the social order. The social order also corresponds in a lot of ways to the physical order and to the moral order. That's the way the church saw it. So the medieval ordo, in terms of the cosmos, is the geocentric view of the world, and that is to say that the earth is the center of everything. The church will say that in this period, but that doesn't mean that the church actually developed that notion. Everybody believed that, and that comes from an ancient idea from science, Ptolemy, who was an ancient Egyptian philosopher, living not all that long after the lifetime of Christ, who also believed that the world was very much like that, that the world, our earth, is the center of everything. And that's the way it has to be, because God's creation, humanity, of course, resides on earth. And it is here that we live, here that we're judged. And that's really the idea. The physical cosmos corresponds to the creation as God intended it. And of course, the church presides over this as the sort of the bridge between this earth, this life, and the next life. That's the notion that the church holds, and that is pretty much what everybody believes, and it's not in conflict with science of that period, right? Now, the church also, of course, as I said, will dominate in the universities, and that's because the most important item in the curriculum was theology. And again, philosophy and theology come together in many ways. But theology is dominant. Of course, the church is going to be dominant there. And it's later, of course, you have the development of the professions. You'll have legal curriculum, law curriculum. You'll have medical as well. But at least initially, theology will dominate. And of course, the people who were the practitioners were called scholastics. That is to say, they were practicing their form of theology, and they were, of course, all Christians. So there's a monopoly here as well. Let's take a look at the theologian, as I mentioned earlier, St. Thomas Aquinas. Let me actually mention first Abelard, because Abelard, like so many theologians, is all about theology also. His main argument, of course, has to do with proving the existence of God. An interesting argument. The argument goes something like this: if God did not exist, then one would have to imagine that there is a being somewhere, who's higher than God. That is a logical impossibility, because no being can be higher than God. Therefore, God must exist. I mean, that was the kind of thinking that theologians, Catholic theologians, would have engaged in. By no means unique. Thomas Aquinas would not disagree with that argument. Thomas Aquinas actually follows many of the arguments of Aristotle. That, to some extent, we owe to the Arabs, who were instrumental in translation. So Aristotle actually comes back, you might say, is revived as a result of having been translated. And Thomas Aquinas will base many of his arguments on the arguments of Aristotle. Now, with respect to one thing, Aristotle had said that, had referred to the unmoved mover, unmoved mover, let's leave it at that. He wasn't talking about the Christian God, of course. It was just his idea of trying to explain where things come from. Aristotle had also said, well, it's possible that everything has always been here, and that our world, however you define the cosmos, our world may be eternal, it may be uncreated, it may have been here. Nevertheless, his idea was taken over that and kind of put into terms of Catholic theology. And what was believed by Thomas Aquinas was the unmoved mover actually becomes God. So he Christianizes Aristotle in that sense. But he also follows Aristotle, because Aristotle had argued that nature is uniform. Nature is created in a lawful way, and therefore it can be studied and one can learn how it actually operates, right? That was Aristotle the scientist. What Thomas Aquinas does, he takes that idea and he essentially says, well, look, nature has form to it, it has shape to it, it has meaning to it. It operates according to laws which were put into it. And therefore it has a sort of a coherence to it. And he argues backward from there, from this coherent, from these sort of natural laws that one finds in nature. One can argue back to say that only a God could have created all this. So he argues from effect back to cause, and he's simply borrowing from Aristotle in that argument. So he is Christianizing this. He's taking the ideas of Aristotle and saying this is not just a natural phenomenon, but this natural phenomenon, these lawful things that occur in nature, actually could only have been put there as the result of a divine plan, of a divine purpose. And therefore, he also says that nature and natural laws must correspond to moral laws, because God not only regularized, not only had a plan for nature, he had a purpose, a divine plan for human beings. And therefore, he created them, and he created a moral order in which they live and work and should obey. So the natural order and the moral order for Thomas Aquinas actually come together as parts of God's creation. And therefore, what one could say is that in the natural order, one can also understand the mind of God, the purpose of God, right? Simply by studying that. So for him, life does have meaning, and people on earth, there is a reason for them being here. It's all part of God's plan. One can either embrace this based on reason, as we've just seen St. Thomas Aquinas did, or one can embrace this simply through faith. So for Aquinas, reason and faith come together. You can get to God simply by believing. You can get to God by showing that he must exist because he was required in order to create the moral order as well as the natural order. So that's where theology stands, and that becomes really, these ideas are comforting, these ideas appear to be logical, and it does appear to many that, you know what, reason and faith really do corroborate each other and support each other. Now, one other thing I want to discuss, and that has to do not with theology, but with the physical appearance, the physical structure of the Catholic Church. And I'm talking about the great cathedrals, and if you ever get to Europe, you should definitely visit some of these. Mont Saint-Michel, for example, which is in Normandy, right off the coast of Normandy, which is an island when the tide is up, which is a peninsula when the tide is down. It's a beautiful place. You should see it at night when it's illuminated. It's very, very impressive. It was an ancient medieval cathedral, an example of Gothic architecture. You could also see Notre Dame in Paris, which is also very, very imposing and very impressive. Chartres, which is about, I'd say, 15, 20 miles away, another great cathedral. Rheims, which is in the east. These great structures are all, they're all Gothic. They're all built over a period of hundreds of years. You can imagine the effort that goes into these great cathedrals. They begin them basically 11th to 12th centuries, and they're all on the Gothic model. What does that mean? Well, these are great structures. They offer a refuge for Christians. They offer a place of worship for them. They offer a place of community for them and a place of meeting like-minded Christians and those who are making pilgrimages. They're all laid out in a certain way, and they're all very different than the cathedrals or churches that have preceded them. Early on, the churches had been built out of wood, but as a result of the invasions of Europe, many of them were burned down. The structures that followed were called Romanesque, and that's where these buildings are made out of stone, because wood is too perishable. But the walls had to be very, very thick in order to support the ceilings if everything's going to be made out of stone. And so the Romanesque churches' walls are extremely wide, and the windows very small, because otherwise the weight of the ceilings won't be supportable. The Gothic church is very different. Walls are much thinner, and there's several reasons for that, several innovations in architecture. For example, instead of the rounded vaults, they have a point to them, which simply allows them, it seems like a very simple difference, but it allows them to bear much more weight as a result. The other thing is the vaults, the ceilings, are supported by ribbings, and it's these ribbings also will simply add on to the support of the ceiling. And a third innovation, and maybe the most important, certainly one of the most important, they're called the flying buttresses. These are simply structures made out of stone They call them wings, but essentially they're there to support the wall. So they're not actually weight on the top of the building. They are supports which are built into the building, and the result is that the walls can be much thinner, and the result also is that the windows can be much bigger, and the result of that is that much more light is let in, and therefore these churches on the inside appear to be somewhat illuminated themselves. But the light coming through the stained glass windows that are going to be used, of course, are extremely impressive. And they all create, in the Gothic church, we have the sense that the church is kind of floating, that it's very kind of a spiritual experience. People nowadays maybe won't have that experience as much, but the idea was that the Gothic church, the interior of the Gothic church, feels like it's almost rising into the heavens. Now, churches were constructed in a certain way to sort of replicate Christian belief. One of my friends actually has spent his lifetime studying these churches, the statuary in them, the stained glass windows, and so on and so forth. Here's how they were laid out. The eastern part of the church, of course, that's the part that faces, that's where the nave will be, and that's the part that faces Jerusalem, right? The western part of the church, where the sun descends, and therefore the darker end, that's where you have scenes also, or in art, which depict the final judgment, the last judgment, and therefore this is the wall in darkness. To the north, the northern wall in the cathedral, there will be scenes from the Old Testament, but the southern wall, which would be the wall which will face the sun much more closely, obviously, you will have scenes from the New Testament, and that is to say, scenes where much more light or much more enlightened, because after all, this is where the truth is. This is the New Testament. So the church is laid out in a certain way, and sort of consistent with the idea of the medieval ordo and the idea that the New Testament is where divine truth and divine revelation actually are. So one could perhaps get that feeling by entering into these churches. You should still try to get there if you can. Some of them, the lighting will change, of course, depending on the position of the sun, depending on how cloudy a day it is. And it's really quite a remarkable thing when you just, even if you're not Christian, you feel in the interior what the cathedral is supposed to be telling you to begin with. And that brings us to a close for today. And next time, we'll take up the threads and we'll take a look at what happens in the next century.